To GWI, I saw Fletcher and Kerem here. Thanks for sponsoring this panel. Today's panel will be, the topic is motivating broadband projects, connected infrastructure and economic development, and I'm proud to be moderating a panel with the most eclectic and diverse group, I think, of the 2 days. We've got Brook Minner here, who is a librarian and downtown Main Street advocate. And we have Dan Kaplan. I think we devote the whole session to why grass-fed beef is better than other beef, but Dan will be talking to us about Heartstone Farm, and Garvan Donegan is here, is with working on economic development in Central Maine Growth Council, and we have Andrew here, who you know from Fourth Economy, great broadband proselytizer, smart community cities, and at the center of a lot I've learned in the state of Maine on this topic. So just a quick unabashed plug about what MTI is. We're Maine Technology Institute. We are located, our home office in Brunswick. We are a 501c3, we'll call ourselves a quasi-state organization. We get about $6 to $7 million a year from the state of Maine since our founding in 1999, so we've just had our 20th anniversary. And we do grants, loans, equity, and some services for new product, service development, research and development, and translating those into the marketplace to create quality, high-quality jobs in Maine. So we want to thank the state and the taxpayers for the last 20 years of continuing to support the Institute. We are not a school. I think maybe I've heard in the economic plan that the name may be changing, but we really are what we call a venture development organization and research and development investor. So with that, I want to give the panel a chance to introduce themselves. Maybe we start with you, Dan, and why does broadband matter to you?
Sure. So I'm a farmer, and I raise grass-fed beef in Charleston, which is about a half-hour north of Bangor, if you're not familiar with it. There's a jail on the hill up there, if you, perhaps that gives you a sense of it. And I started raising beef about 6 years ago. I'd had kind of a career as an entrepreneur in technology and media, but my lifelong dream had actually been to be a farmer, and so I bought a farm, I started raising cattle, and I guess I didn't ask the question before I moved onto this farm, which is, was there internet? And, well, there wasn't. And so for years, we tried satellite, we tried hotspot with cell phone, we tried DSL, you name it, we tried it. Didn't work, it would be, intermittent and not reliable. And this was actually beginning to interfere with my business plan. My business plan was to sell our beef directly to consumers wherever they were. And by doing that, to be able to capture the value that marketers get, farmers don't make money, marketers make money. So, so in order to do that, we had to have always-on broadband access. And about a year ago, actually, last October, we finally figured out that if we put an antenna up in a pine tree about 100 feet high and pointed it towards where the jail is, there was another antenna there, and we finally got always on, pretty good broadband access. Our sales are right now 4 times what they were last year at this time, and that's due to our ability to market, to execute, to ship. We ship every Tuesday. Today we have about 45 shipments going out, about $150 on average, all the way out to Chicago. The technology and the broadband enabled that. So I guess I'm a poster boy for why rural broadband can make a difference.
Great. So my name is Brook Minner, and like many people in Maine, I have multiple jobs, so I'm here wearing two hats, actually. I'm a founder and currently the executive director of Main Street Bucksport, which is a downtown economic and community redevelopment organization in Bucksport, which is where I live. My husband and I also own a real estate company in Bucksport, and that plays into this as well. But I'm also a librarian. Actually, really, I'm a librarian. And so I'm the library director in Brooksville, which is a small coastal town on the Blue Hill Peninsula. And both Bucksport and Brooksville have very differing situations when it comes to connectivity. But the Brooksville situation is the more challenging one by a lot. There are a couple people here today from Brooksville's Broadband committee, and a lot of work has been going on over the past couple of years to try to address the fact that many people effectively have no internet service at their house, and many of those who do, it's essentially not usable because it's so slow. So I'll say more about what's happening formally, but I kind of come to this issue from wearing both those hats around economic and community development, but also just basic access for communities. The only upside to the horrible internet in Brooksville is that the library is the place everybody has to come in order to use it. So it's good for us, but ultimately I'd like to, not be playing that role in town. So yeah, I can say more about that later, but that's why I'm here.
Good afternoon. Good to see everybody. Garvan, Donegan, Director of Planning and Economic Development with the Central Maine Growth Council. For those of you not familiar with the Central Maine Growth Council, we are a public-private economic development corporation. We are mission-driven, quasi-governmental, ostensibly serving as the economic development and, in some cases, the planning department for the surrounding municipal governments, including the City of Waterville, Town of Fairfield, Town of Winslow, and Town of Oakland, and then do quite a bit of work doing inside or outside advising within the public sector, private sector, philanthropic and civic community as well. Why is broadband important to me? I would answer that by saying critically important from both a supply and demand side economic development challenge and opportunity. What I mean by that is creating the demand in which a business or a community or a resident or an initiative can come in, but also simply supplying proper infrastructure to the broader community as we think about where things go and in the systems we live. So do come from this from kind of a city planning, economic development perspective. This afternoon, happy to go into more detail, probably three corners of the deal, if you will, from a city planning perspective, thinking about the town, the small town or city or the metropolitan landscape as a system or an ecosystem in terms of where we site things and why. From an economic development perspective, what it means to either recruit an IT company or a telemedicine company or think about the build out of a broadband or a broadband type project. And then maybe lastly, and dovetailing from a community development perspective, in thinking about different financial instruments as well as maybe two case models I'm happy to touch on. We have recently developed, own, and manage a free public Wi-Fi initiative for downtown, and then likewise doing a rural broadband project for the town of Oakland to essentially map and analyze their resources to really then put them in the best position for a infrastructure build out with regards from planning, engineering, and putting together a nice diverse finance stack. So thank you for having me today. Look forward to chatting.
Thanks. Hi, friends. Andrew Butcher. As you know, I work with Maine Broadband Coalition. In addition to that, I'm a social entrepreneur. I was very fortunate to turn my graduate research at Carnegie Mellon into a thriving social enterprise in Pittsburgh at the intersection of community development and environmental health. I moved to Maine 2 years ago and became a consultant where I'm fortunate to work with communities around the country and increasingly communities and organizations around Maine on issues of community resilience. In doing so, I've been fortunate to be able to work with the city of Portland and the city of Lewiston now in developing their smart infrastructure strategy, which has led to an MTI-funded initiative, now also with support from AARP Maine, establishing a Smart Communities Maine initiative, looking to help support communities that are looking to invest in smart and connected infrastructure. So my perspective today on this panel is very much to talk about non-traditional demand aggregation from the public sector standpoint. And when I say that out loud, it's about the nerdiest thing I've ever said. What I mean by public sector demand aggregation is how many folks in the room work with local or regional government in some capacity? A good amount of you. How many local elected officials? Good smattering. Increasingly, communities are looking at the role of technology to help fuel and support their infrastructure to perform as well as possible. And it's everything from the street lights that many communities are converting and connecting to be remotely controlled, to adaptive traffic control signals, to things like water sensors or air quality sensors. And not only does that result in a requirement for improving performance at a municipal level, it results in the ability to tap into the civic innovation that is fueled by your broadband committees. And more specifically, it's representative by, in order to make those things work, there needs to be the physical infrastructure to do so. So if your community wants to perform better and use data to drive that performance, yeah, we can do some of it over copper lines, but most of it's going to require fiber. So I'm here to talk a little bit about that work.
Thank you. For questions, if you write your questions, doesn't matter what color card, just flag yourself, and those questions will make themselves their way up here. So thank you. Thanks, panel. I was just wondering, maybe we get a little deeper into each of your individual experiences from your industry or sector, and talk about what you hear, maybe from 10 years ago and today, on what the motivators are, and who in your individual communities, from farming to Main Street economic development, what are the groups that you're associating with to drive some of this? Well, we can go backwards if you want.
We'll go backwards.
And you don't all have to talk if you don't want to. That's fine.
Well, I'll keep my response fairly short on this, and I maybe drill into the example of the community of Lewiston. Is anybody from here from Lewiston or live in Lewiston? One. Great. Noted. So the city of Lewiston is at a really interesting stage in their planning for smart infrastructure. The city's Department of Economic Development recognized as it is pursuing a transformational level of infrastructure and housing development, that they could get ahead of the curve in looking at the role of smart and connected technology to enhance that development and to build from the existing community priorities that were identified. So in some ways, I see Lewiston at a little bit of a disadvantage because I don't think there's a broadband planning committee in Lewiston. I don't think broadband is really on the radar for community members in Lewiston. But what they have is really clear community priorities that have been established through their housing development plans. And that has been a key pathway for them looking at the role of smart and connected technology in an efficient way. So if you have a broadband planning committee, then the opportunities for thinking about the right and appropriate level of technology to help your municipality and local government perform better, I think is exponentially more possible.
I often like to ask people to try to define economic development. I do find that it's a very complicated and hard thing to define in a succinct manner. If I were to pose the question to the crowd, and feel free to anybody jump in, you'd probably hear the panacea of recruiting a business or a grant or workforce development or getting new equipment. And as it relates to this afternoon, I would say that what economic development means to me is creating the conditions in which growth can occur. And that is critically important with regards to having 21st global economy infrastructure. From the economic development perspective of maybe doing that firm recruitment or working with that business to expand, and more anecdotal, maybe only second to the human capital question and the labor economics is connectivity, how I'm going to interface with the 21st global economy. So that is very much the confluence of the reasons why we're certainly working on broadband in Middle Maine here. Similarly, in recently recruiting some IT systems, what that means, as well as, not unique to Maine, I think, going through the 21st, the post-mill and manufacturing milieu of what has occurred to the mill and manufacturing industry and how economies are trying to move forward into kind of a 21st tech industry, critically important to be connected to the world. So when we're working with companies, it's only the second or third question that gets asked. Likewise, redundancy, speeds, and/or plans to grow it. So I would encourage, and as that's been discussed, do your broadband planning committees. More specifically, what we do have, I think, here locally, as we sit here in the city of Waterville, is very similar to other communities. The tale of two cities, if you will. It being the best of times and the worst of times, as in particular, once you get out into the hinterlands, and that broadband access really drop very quickly. So from a city planning perspective and thinking about where our assets are, our asset mapping, thinking about that multi-criterion analysis, where you have domestic infrastructure, where you have broadband, where you have natural gas, that is all going to make for better site location for a variety of usages. And then thinking about communicating that to a business to grow, then communicating that to a community to put together those finance stacks. And I guess now that Commissioner Johnson has left, we can talk about her, and she won't have to get all the
it says
feedback.
right here, do not talk
Do not talk about her,
the
okay.
commissioner.
Well, I think actually we are at an inflection point to grow broadband infrastructure in the state of Maine, and do give DCD a lot of credit, and Commissioner Johnson as well, for being out front of this, but would also say, make sure to be looking at your philanthropic community. The state does have a very robust nonprofit and philanthropic sector that are deploying funds right now, as evidenced by Maine Community Foundation. We recently secured a broadband planning grant from them in the town of Oakland, which has been critically important. Look at those public finance tools, but it may be interesting on the horizon to think about how the private sector can continue to play a critically important role, but also looking at new instruments such as O-zones or opportunity zones as levers to capitalize on private sector and investment, and how those O-zones might be able to be used for investments in public infrastructure as kind of a unique and sophisticated add-on to your finance stack if you're thinking about a build-out of fiber infrastructure.
Thanks, Garvan. From the librarian and the farmer, maybe you guys could talk about what are the librarians nationally, locally? What are you guys doing to try to get together? And the same thing, what are you seeing in trends coming out? How do you group and do what the commissioner said, advocate?
Right. So in Brooksville, there is a broadband committee, as I mentioned, also received funding from Maine Community Foundation. I'm on that committee, but it's been, really citizen-driven and brought together a diverse group of people with different backgrounds to try to look in how to solve this problem. We have applied for a rural development grant, but I think even more importantly, Brooksville has partnered with 5 surrounding communities, and then a less formal partnership with a few other towns that are even further afield, because as I'm sure you've talked about throughout these last couple days, it's really, this needs a regional approach. So that has been recognized in Brooksville, and I'm actually hopeful that should the grant come through and all the things fall into place that need to, we might see a real change. And for Brooksville, because it's a small town, it's about 900 people with an aging population, the school, it has its own K through 8 school, which is really important to the community, and it has about 70 or 80 students total. And that number, has slowly gone down over the years. And so without high-speed access that would allow new young families, new people to stay in Brooksville or to move to town, there's just going to be this whole ripple effect on the community itself. Part of the work that the Broadband Committee did in Brooksville was to collect several hundred surveys from community members, both year-round and seasonal. Brooksville, of course, being on the coast, has a large seasonal population. And not surprisingly, what we heard back was that there are many people who either would love to stay in Brooksville year-round, which would have a major impact on the community in a bunch of different ways, but they can't because they can't work, because they don't have high-speed access, or businesses that are in town who their productivity is suffering because, one of the examples was they submit payroll for their 8 employees, and every time she hits the send button on the payroll, she, sort of holds her breath, hoping that it will go through. Which is crazy at the end of 2019. So, the impact there is very real. And like many small Maine towns, there's fears, I think, that the community itself will not remain year-round and solvent looking, down the road. Bucksport has a very different situation, as I'm sure many of you know, and speaking of the post-mill economy, I was late this morning because the largest stack on our former paper mill was taken down today. It was pretty dramatic. You'll probably see some pictures online. And so I was there with, several hundred of my neighbors to watch that happen. What's happening, as you, I'm sure, also know, in place of our paper mill is a very high-tech aquaculture industry that is moving in, as well as an expansion of the Maine Maritime campus on that same site. There's a lot of really exciting things happening in Bucksport when it comes to economic development, both on the large scale, those projects, but also small businesses in our downtown. We've had 14 new businesses open in 3 years. And we're seeing that impact through the real estate market, which is really through the roof and has been for the past couple of years. And speaking of the convergence of what people need, we are just sort of fortunate in Bucksport that we kind of have it. We are sitting on the 3-ring binder. There was a local effort underway a few years ago to study how to tap into that and make the most of it. That effort was studied. Nothing ever happened. I'm very hopeful with the whole Oceans project coming that there will be a renewed effort on that front. And we have rail and water and all of the other things, natural gas in town. But I think, like so many communities, we still are probably behind. Whole Oceans is going to be breaking ground in the spring, and this kind of work, particularly around the 3-ring binder access, really needs to be happening last year.
Thank you, Brooke.
Yeah.
Dan, what's motivating and what do you see for trends in the farming and ag community?
Well, I'll be honest, listening to all of this, I can tell you, I don't know a whole lot about business development and some of the aspects that have gone on, but I can tell you that I was on my own to get broadband. Yeah. And the economics, I'm wondering how much you guys are working on this, I was about a little over a mile from a fiber optic, and when I talked to the company about getting that to my house, I was told they would be glad to do that. It would cost $18,000, which is not something I was capable of doing. And so it seems to me that you could put fiber optic everywhere, and you would leave the farmers out because it's not economic. To be a mile away from the cable. There's no economics that can solve that, right? Nobody wants to, throw $18,000 at each household. So, my sense of it was that the solution for us was this kind of point-to-point thing, And that, I don't know anything about the technology, but I can imagine that point-to-point wireless will enable access to a lot more than maybe laying fiber optic when so many farmers are so far away. It's just not economic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think
No.
that's exactly a good point. Do you see USDA or Maine Ag or anybody working and reaching out to the community?
I'm not familiar with any programs they might have.
Okay, there's an opportunity for all of you.
I've done other things with USDA and gotten,
Yeah.
help from them. But again, at some point, somebody, I guess my question would be, is there somebody, why would somebody pay $18,000 for every farmer who's a mile away from fiber optic? It doesn't, that's just kind of like, there must be a better, maybe wireless
Did you
solution.
also say, since you hooked up to the internet and got online, that your sales are 4X?
Yeah, they absolutely are. And
Yeah.
so, even when I got that price tag of 18,000, I did for a little bit try to figure out, is there a way that I could amortize that as a business over 5 years or whatever, the same way a utility company might amortize the cost of running line, but it's $18,000.
Yep, no, that's great. Andrew, do you want to say something, or?
I can wait.
Okay, so we've got a few questions here, and I'm going to try to aggregate a couple of them. One is about resiliency and the discussion about, and I guess it might be for the economic developers too, how can we deal with poles going down in storms, and what can we do for resiliency? Do you see the opportunity for rural as a lot of underground in Maine? And are there any sort of regional utilities that are working on that type of thing?
Wireless?
Yeah, I think Dan's point is go wireless, but somewhere there's
Don't fall into it.
somewhere there's still a pole that connects to or something.
So it probably does depend on the site location itself, the geospatial of the land, your very site-specific issue that you're trying to be doing your good resiliency planning around. So in some cases, that very well may mean, say, for example, you're in a dense and even in a downtown district, reviewing that, are you changing Main Street from one-way to two-way? It might make sense to then go subsurface with your broadband infrastructure. Maybe in some cases it is Wi-Fi. I think, and I hate to sound like an attorney because I'm not, it depends, and it's going to depend on those case specifics. And the general, the cost, of course. The cost is going to be a real issue, as well as, though I do think we do see the build-out linear per mile does continue to go incrementally downwards. In the city of Waterville, we are thinking about, and you will likely see some of our denser downtown districts will likely go subsurface, but you'll also see the infrastructure going above surface on the poles, and then again doing Wi-Fi, though a couple of caveats there in the intent of that technology, and that being more a placemaking strategy and not necessarily broad free Wi-Fi for every residential user.
Garvan, before you pass the mic, one of the other questions was how important has free Wi-Fi been for the downtown in Waterville?
Yeah, thank you to whoever asked that question. It has been an economic development strategy around placemaking, around creating a sense of place, vibrancy, drawing from some of our great assets, not including some of our landscape conservation and pocket park. It's an open space. So we've seen a significant amount of usage. We're very data-driven, and we do track all those data trends. We have approximately 6 hotspots. They work line of sight in terms of technology. By design, the tech we deployed does not penetrate walls for a variety of reasons, not limited to we didn't want to compete with maybe a coffee shop or a restaurant or a business that people would like to go in there and pop in to get Wi-Fi. Likewise, we didn't want Jimmy upstairs streaming Netflix, using all our bandwidth. So it's been great for our farmers markets. We have good data in terms of usage, e-commerce during concerts, outdoor vendors, and then what is kind of more anecdotal but interesting, I do now get a variety of weird calls and emails on a number of different topics, including folks thinking that it's free Wi-Fi if you take an apartment in downtown Waterville. So while that is not the intent of the Wi-Fi, we are seeing this thinking in what it means to the housing stock and increasing residential density. But again, I think it speaks to how diverse and important this technology is. And it's becoming, as folks have noted, just how critically important it is, kind of expected, that maybe if you're walking along a main street or enjoying a concert outside or doing a First Friday art walk or doing an art in a park, you might be able to jump online and make a transaction or see a calendar of events. And for all those reasons, we're in our second year and having really nice success with the tech. Not ubiquitous, challenges, of course, though.
Andrew, did you want to make a comment on the resiliency question, and is Maine disadvantaged with the number of trees and power? And
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways of cutting that, and I'll answer it in a slightly different way, at a very tangible way, and then in a slightly more meta way. So how many folks in the room are involved with AARP in one way or another? A handful of folks.
who doesn't want to admit it? Who doesn't want to admit it? Yeah. That's it.
I am involved with AARP because AARP has recognized that in order for communities to be friendly for the elderly population, they have to be friendly for everybody. So if they're attractive to the elderly, they'll be livable for the rest of us. And I think when we think about the role of community and resiliency, that's a really important lens of thinking about an inclusive way of approaching it. And so when we talk about resilience, we can talk about power redundancy, and we can talk about having the technology and the software in place. But a big part of it is the level of input from a human standpoint that goes to inform the plans and the networks and the designs. And so, when we were planning this kind of session, some of this conference, Fletcher actually dared me to see if we could get a farmer, a librarian, and some economic development nerds together to talk about the same thing. So we did it. So that's a very targeted point, right? And the meta point being that resilience is very much a function of the diversity of inputs and the diversity of uses. And so as we go about planning the things that we need to get our basic infrastructure, to get our needs met, factoring in the perspective of the local business, factoring in the perspective of the agricultural sector, factoring in the needs and perspective of different populations, elderly populations, students, schools. This is an important component of resilience that I would just highlight.
Good. Thanks. Just to maybe touch on the next panel a little bit on the health. I come from, before MTI, I was with IDEX Laboratories for 10 years, from little company to big company. And that entire company, we used to make diagnostic tests for farmers. I worked in production animal, chickens, pigs, cattle. And that company has completely morphed itself into a telemedicine company for the veterinary industry. Do you see any opportunities, Dan, for working with your large animal vets or anything that you're doing through medicine that way?
Well, I've had a lame cow that I took a movie of and sent it by messenger to my vet. And he said, she looks fine. And so that was my high tech. But absolutely, I think whether it's the vet or, we have 100 acres of pastures. We move our cattle all the time. We use a technology that tracks where they are and is a planning tool and is, GPS based and primarily a cellular connection. So I think that kind of stuff is pretty exciting and has a lot of potential. And it'd be great to not have to do the video through Messenger and do some other
Yeah.
kind of easier tech.
Even some of the stuff I've seen is you send your sonogram or your sensor information through that way too. So one other question I think I have on the same thing, but let's do the quick human health side. We were talking about motivators or drivers. And not to steal from the next panel too much, one of the things I've seen and companies that we've worked with, I'm working with one now, I think I mentioned Andrew called Sensio Systems, that's looking at MTI for potential funding, working with the state. Do you ever see a time where telemedicine gets to a point where maybe it's your internet broadband access is sort of like a reimbursable medical code?
Sounds good.
See, just,
I can't answer that one.
Haven't seen it in practice in the state of Maine yet, but the practical matter is rural telemedicine and telematics infrastructure are likely inextricably linked. And what we are seeing and likely deploying is working with some of the larger healthcare institutions, and particularly what the outlook, the economic outlook and forecasts with medicine in the state of Maine is likely continued growth. Approximately 1 in 3 Mainers do work in healthcare. It is arguably our largest GDP creator. And so while we'll continue to see more consolidations likely with regards to the larger hospitals, it will also raise the need to deploy more satellite and medical clinics. So what we are chatting with some of the larger providers on is deploying and kind of spinning up rural telemedicine type clinics where folks can go into, or there can be kind of a hub and spoke system that folks can utilize via the internet. So that does sound uniquely wonderful, but haven't had any experience with it yet. However, and I think some of the great models actually coming out of some of our coastal communities and islands where it's sustainability has long been just practical. We'll be seeing that in rural Maine here.
great. Yes. The microphone somewhere.
I'm involved a little bit with Northern Light Health, and I can tell you that virtual physical exams and outpatient visits is definitely coming. And it's particularly relevant in our rural communities where transportation is a huge issue. People are missing appointments all the time because they can't get rides, they don't drive. So we have volunteer individuals and organizations that are doing that. But with good high-speed internet, these virtual visits are going to be essential to kind of the healthcare of the future in this area. And already all of the hospitals have telemedicine connections with, like Blue Hill Hospital, it has connections with Acadia Hospital if somebody comes in and they got to determine whether this patient needs to be admitted or not. We have connections now that go down to Mass General for complicated cases that we're not taking care of here. So virtual medical referrals and consultations and outpatient visits is definitely on track.
There you go. Maybe we could put that one in the plan somewhere. You know, if you're going to sell healthcare in Maine, maybe it needs to somehow help pay for your internet so you don't have to drive 60 miles and you can get point of care right in your home. I had another question here, and I'm wondering if it's for me. The question was, how do you measure successful, healthy economy that is the core of what your investments are aimed at accomplishing? So either ours or, and I'm wondering if it's MTI, but, you know, constant growth is a pipe dream, it says, but resiliency, thriving, inclusion aims are real. You know, I'll just comment to why I'm even standing here and why this is relevant to MTI's mission of funding, supporting, stimulating research, development, and new products, services in like 7 different tech sectors, and I'll name those quickly. And the reason we're here and were created in 1999 by the legislature as a nonprofit entity is because the state, looking around at the time, the planning office and others said that, looked at Maine and said, the investments that our companies and our economy are making, and state, are making in research and development of new products, services, and processes was, in Angus's words back then, somewhere 51st behind Puerto Rico. And what we found is they said then was, because of the 3 core traditional economic drivers in the state, which were things like tourism, fishing, farming, agriculture, and forestry, those were not inherent industries that invested a lot in the future. If they did adapt and take on new technology, it was developed somewhere else, or maybe those GPS things that, they weren't developed here. So part of MTI's mission is to fund businesses that are developing new products, approaching things from a brand new way, so that they tend to be more resilient. They have higher margins. They tend to pay higher, a lot of them are STEM type jobs, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, and there's some art, creatives thrown in there too. But those tend to be new businesses that are creating products that are differentiated and new to the world. Therefore, again, they have higher margins. In a downturn in an economy, it adds to the Maine's economic diversity, so those things don't get crunched like potentially a lower margin tourism-oriented business. So it's not that those other things are not important, but Maine's made the conscious effort to invest in MTI to help accelerate the development of some of those. Any MTI portfolio companies in the audience? Will, raise your hand. John Belding, University of Maine, we work with them. Is that Seth back there? Kennebec River Biosciences. So you might talk to some of those folks and bring back to your communities that unless they have this type of access, the 7 sectors we invest in, information technology, really can't have that in your community. Composites, materials, advanced materials, precision manufacturing. Most of those businesses all require plans to be moved, shipped, information to be exchanged with their clients and customers. Aquaculture, marine technology, there's a lot of bioscience there. Again, in fish health and industry health, if you're not able to communicate and send diagnostic information back and forth, you're at a disadvantage. I think I mentioned forestry and agriculture, and environmental and energy technologies are what we invest in. So I just wanted to, maybe try to answer this question about how do you measure that. Our businesses that MTI invests in should have higher revenue growth than the average Maine company. They should pay higher wages and benefits. They should be have higher margin growth and have higher payroll growth. So those are the types of things. If that's what our companies look like in our portfolio, then that's a great thing. We'll also invest, like Andrew mentioned, in why would we put any money into, broadband interest in customer discovery? Because we don't typically hear on a day-to-day basis that, hey, you know what, I can't grow without broadband, because I think those companies are already in locations that have that. So there's a chicken and egg thing. If you don't have it, it's going to be hard for us to find companies in your area that we can invest in, especially when we're trying to address the geography. So we do support things that instigate more portfolio companies or deal flow to us, and support the companies that we've already invested in their growth. So hopefully that answers that question.
I also need to just double click on that, because I think it's really worth underscoring, right? So just to clarify, what I'm hearing you say is that you all have a willingness to invest in new businesses and sectors. And if you don't know that there are businesses that can't thrive because of a lack of infrastructure, you can't invest in them. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, the innovation economy businesses, that doesn't, that's a subset.
Yes.
Cannot exist in your region without that. Thus, we will not have any deal flow out of rural Maine.
So I feel like that's yet another excellent call to action among the broadband planning committees and thinking about, MTI needs to hear from the businesses, the entrepreneurs, and the innovation economy that is bubbling in your communities to be able to be a partner in that. So I think that's just worthwhile underscoring.
Any other questions from the audience? Microphone. We'll start over here on my right, and it looks like 1, 2, and 3 in a row. And that could bring us to the end of the session.
That was my question, actually, about how do you measure a strong, successful economy?
How'd I do?
You did great for the larger communities because we're rural and we're small. We're basically a bedroom community to employment largely elsewhere. We don't have a downtown. People are talking about what they're doing in their downtowns, and I wish we had those measures available to us. So how you measure a healthy economy in a town like mine is a very different matter. Will we see economic development dollars going to improve the town of Somerville people's opportunities? If an aim is broadband because it's identified as a public way, a public good, then that's good. If there's help with people that 47% of which can't afford to buy or rent a home in our town that live here, then that's good. But if we're talking about investing in companies that aren't here in our town, if we're talking about other kinds of investment that we have no place for, how can we get rural communities like ours in the state of Maine to not be left behind?
Panel?
How do you measure it?
I'll take this, and without getting into location theory or geographic economics, very tough challenge, I think, within rural economic development, not unique to your community. You mentioned bedroom community, looking at your assets, and in the past, a bedroom community maybe has been reflected on as a weakness, but in thinking about Maine's housing stock, for example, that could actually be a strength. Thinking about what you have as a focus, and fortunately, unfortunately, the growth that we'll likely see in Maine, and because of our labor demographics, right, aging population, met by a declining population, going to see a lot of growth in those metropolitan hubs. So with that said, and this may sound trite, good planning is going to be even more critically important for your community. If you don't have a comp plan, that probably means, which is technically required by Maine state statute, thinking about your assets, thinking about a multi-criterion analysis where you do have domestic infrastructure or broadband. And then if not, maybe it turns into a more place-based economic strategy about quality of life. Again, back to your housing, the return to the rivers, and focusing on ag and some of that new environmental technology. So really difficult challenge. And your tip of your spear is frankly going to be your labor economics. That IT business is not going to move to your town even if it does have broadband if there's no people. So I'd go back to human capital, people. How are we growing and retaining a robust and brilliant young workforce will be key to answer that question. Sorry, that was kind of tangential.
Thank you.
So I heard the resilience and redundancy question, and of course I got very excited, but Peggy tells me it's not my turn to talk today. So she said I need to write a blog on it, and I'm going to have that up this week on the Broadband Coalition website, and I hope people will read it.
Excellent. Thanks, Fletcher.
Excellent.
We have, I think Mia has a question, and I just want to say that I've been saying this a lot in the climate change realm. Some of you have heard me say it. I think broadband in rural Maine is the single most important investment we can make to deal with climate change.
Thank you. So I work for the Community Concepts Finance Corporation, which is a CDFI, and we mostly are dealing with rural areas, although we do also work in Lewiston. And you've been talking about access, but there's another piece of the equation, at least one, and that's affordability. And for a lot of small businesses, especially in rural areas, access is a huge issue, but so is affordability. And I'm just wondering how you would address that issue, especially in the more rural areas, because getting broadband for a lot of small businesses is not real affordable.
What, maybe here from Main Street? How's that, how the price is looking on Main Street? Maybe Dan, I don't know what you're paying a month.
No, I think it absolutely is an issue for businesses in our community, not only the access to the high speed, but then the equipment that you need to efficiently use it. And, one of the things, because we have had such an explosion of small business growth within our downtown, we're already starting to see some of those early businesses that opened right after the mill fail for a variety of reasons, but the cost of being connected and having the appropriate equipment to use that connection is absolutely a factor for them. And then, I do work in our downtown, but Bucksport's pretty spread out actually geographically, so there are a lot of home-based businesses as well as farmers and other kinds of agricultural businesses that are outside that have no access at all. So there's this whole wide variety. And I don't see anything, certainly on the municipal level, that's happening to address that. I don't know if you want to. Yep.
Just curious, Dan, what do you think with your system of
I guess my main feeling about it was beggars can't be choosers, in terms of cost. There was some point at which we were relying on a Verizon hotspot when Verizon was still charging by how much data you used. And we would get these like $200, $300 bills for unreliable service. But cost is a factor. That was obviously not sustainable. The $18,000 last mile. To me, it's worth it to get, almost at whatever cost. But I sometimes, my kids live in like Seattle and Los Angeles, and I go and visit them and realize what internet connections really are.
In a system like yours right now, what's that roughly costing your business?
For internet, I think it's $110 for a
per month.
Per month, but not the great. It's an always-on connection, but it's not the speediest connection.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to interrupt. Just going to say, have your community do a survey and be data-driven on the take rates, and that maybe attract another ISP.
Okay, we're wrapping up. I'm going to hear maybe in the next panel or some other one. I was just curious I'm a former town councilor in Freeport, 2 terms, planning board there. And if you drive through the second most tourist visited state in the state, you cannot get internet in our downtown. So I apologize for that. I failed. And then second, I just wanted to say, I wonder if there's ways to use the cable franchising fees to help with some of the deployment. So I'm going to be asking some questions around that. For us, that's a couple $100,000 a year, and more people keep cutting the cord. So I'll be curious. Thank you very much, panel. You guys were great.
Thank you, everybody. Before everybody jumps up.
Thank you for having us.